Feminism. It's a word we hear all the time, right? But what does it really mean? Well, the answer to that has changed a lot over the last century. So in this explainer, we're going to break down that history wave by wave to really get a handle on how this powerful idea has evolved. Let's get into it.
But before we jump into all the different waves, I want to ask you something. I mean, think about it. With over 100 years of different voices, different goals, even different conflicts, what's the one single idea that connects all feminists, from the women fighting for the vote all the way to today's activists?
Well, at its very heart, the answer is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly profound. Across every single era and every group, the whole movement is really held together by this one goal: ending discrimination against women and fighting for their right to live a life of dignity. So hang on to that core principle, because it's the foundation for literally everything we're about to talk about. Okay, so our story kicks off with the first wave. You can think of this as the movement's ground floor. This was a time when the fight wasn't about, abstract theories. It was about securing the most basic, concrete rights you can have in a society. All right, so before we dive too deep into that first wave, let's zoom out for a second and look at the big picture. The history of feminism is usually broken down into these three main phases. We're starting with that initial fight for rights, but as you'll see, the movement grows to start questioning the system itself, and then later to embracing diversity in a huge way. Now, what's so important to get about this first wave is that it wasn't just one single movement. Right from the start, two very different ways of thinking popped up. On one side, you had liberal feminists. Their focus was on changing the law. They wanted political equality, and for them, the holy grail was the right to vote. But on the other side, you had socialist feminists, who saw a totally different enemy. They were arguing that the legal system was just a symptom of a much bigger problem: capitalism. The ideas behind that liberal path, well, they were sparked way earlier by thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft. In her game-changing book, she basically pointed out this massive contradiction. She said, hold on, how can our society be all about the rights of man that came out of the French Revolution while completely denying those exact same rights to women? It was a simple but super powerful argument for just being equal in the eyes of the law. Meanwhile, the socialist viewpoint really gets sharp with Friedrich Engels. He argued that the whole idea of women being oppressed wasn't some natural, it's always been this way thing. Nope. He said it was a historical invention, something born directly out of the rise of private property and capitalism. So from their perspective, just fighting for the vote was kind of missing the bigger picture. For them, real freedom could only happen if you tore down the whole economic system. So the first wave gets its biggest win: women get the right to vote. Huge! But fast forward a few decades to the 1960s, and it was becoming crystal clear that having a right on paper didn't mean you had real equality in your life. There was a deeper, more invisible problem still out there. And figuring that out is what ignited the second wave. The story of this wave really kicks off right here with a survey by a woman named Betty Friedan. She started talking to these women who, on paper, they had it all. They had the husband, the nice house in the suburbs, the kids. They had achieved the so-called American dream. And yet, she discovered they were just deeply, deeply unhappy. But here was the mystery. They couldn't even explain why. They couldn't put their finger on what was wrong. And Friedan captured this quiet, widespread feeling of despair with this incredibly haunting phrase. She called it the problem that has no name. And then, pretty soon, that nameless problem got a name: patriarchy. This was the massive aha moment of the second wave. The real enemy wasn't just a few bad laws, it was an invisible, all-around-us social system, a structure that was built by men, for men, and it shaped pretty much every part of your daily life. Now, to really wrap their heads around patriarchy, second-wave thinkers made this absolutely crucial distinction. Sex, they said, is biological. It's male and female. Simple enough. But gender? That's totally different. Gender is cultural. It's the set of roles, the expectations, and the values that society basically assigns to you based on your sex. And they realized, aha, patriarchy is a system built entirely on these cultural ideas of gender. And look, this wasn't just some abstract academic theory. It had devastating, horrifying, real-world consequences. The problem wasn't just a vague feeling of unhappiness. Second-wave feminists started drawing a direct line from this system of patriarchy to the most extreme acts of violence against women, violence that the system often just looked away from or even quietly excused.
So, all this deep thinking about the system led to one of the most powerful and famous slogans of the entire movement. It was a simple phrase that would completely redraw the map of what we even considered to be politics, and that phrase was, "The personal is political." See, for centuries, society was split into these two neat little boxes. You had the public world, that was politics, work, business, the man's world. And then you had the private world, home, family, kids, the woman's world. But this new generation of radical feminists came along and said, hold on a minute, that separation isn't natural. It's a political wall, and it was built to hide inequality and keep women powerless. So what does the personal is political actually mean? Well, the scholar Susan Muller-Oken broke it down into 4 key points. First, politics doesn't stop at your front door. The power dynamics inside a family are political, and the government absolutely has a duty to step in to stop things like domestic abuse. Second, that so-called private home is already getting hit by public policy, everything from tax laws to healthcare. Third, the family is the first place we learn the rules of patriarchy, which makes us think they're just normal. And finally, a woman's personal choices about who she marries, if she has kids, what she studies, all have massive public and economic results.
Okay, so if patriarchy isn't natural, how does it keep going? Betty Friedan argued it's held up by something she called the feminine mystique. Think of it like this powerful web of stories and myths that culture tells us about what a good woman is supposed to be. These myths tell women how they should look, how they should act, and what they should want, and that's what keeps them trapped in the system.
But history has a way of repeating itself. Just like the second wave challenged the first, by the 1990s, a whole new generation came along and started challenging the second. They asked a really critical question. Is there actually one single woman's experience? And that question is what launched the third wave, a movement that was all about embracing diversity, complexity, and a whole lot of different voices.
You see, the third wave wasn't just one movement. It was many movements. Thinkers started to argue that this idea of a universal woman was basically a myth. You couldn't just talk about gender by itself anymore. A woman's experience, they said, is totally shaped by how her gender intersects with her race, her class, her sexuality, and where in the world she lives.
So, for example, you had Black feminists, like the amazing Bell Hooks, who argued that Black women face this unique struggle because they're fighting both patriarchy and racism at the same time. And in a similar way, post-colonial feminists pointed out that women in the developing world are dealing with the legacy of colonialism, a totally different fight than the one women in the West were facing. And then another really powerful idea emerged, Eco-Feminism. Scholars like Vandana Shiva made this pretty startling connection. They argued that the patriarchal, consumer-driven way of thinking that leads to the exploitation of women is the exact same mindset that leads to the exploitation and destruction of the natural world. And that kind of brings us up to today. From fighting for a vote, to naming the system, to embracing countless different voices, the one thing that's been constant about feminism is that it never, ever stops evolving. Which leaves us with one last question to think about. In a world with new technologies, new social challenges, and new identities, what do you think the next wave of feminism will be fighting for?